had to stay facing God with all of my pain and confusion and heartache and agony. And sometimes I'd have an image of me almost like beating my fist, on God's chest, because of course that it's not fair. Like, how could this have happened? All the prayers, all those questions. But I just knew you have to stay facing God and not turn your back. Yeah. Because as soon as you turn your back on God, for me, it was like I've lost so much. But if I lose my connection to my Father, I've lost everything. I've lost the only way that can get me through this.
Hello and welcome to Good News People, a podcast where we talk about the brilliant thing God is doing right now and how we live as good news people in a bad news world. I'm Phil Knox and I'm here with Gav and Phil. We are followers of Jesus, leaders, evangelists, and have been great mates for over 20 years. Gav, what are we exploring today?
So today is the tension between being hopeful and realistic. On one hand, we have always got to remind ourselves that hope is our currency. We can be outrageously optimistic about the present and the future. In fact, we're good at that. Our cup overfloweth, like the psalmist. But that doesn't mean we don't confront the daily realities of life and the challenges of the circumstances we face. Life is full of battles and blessings, and we need an honest realism and an audacious hope. This could be the most difficult tension we've talked about yet.
Yeah, but it's also one I'm really excited about diving into. And before we do, one of the things we're trying to do on this podcast is counteract the negative narrative in our news feeds. Gav, tell us a good news story. Give us something encouraging you're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, it was just last weekend. I was up in Rotherham. There was a lady there who's been going to a number of their groups for ages, has never actually made a decision to follow Jesus, and the church have been praying for loads. At the end of my talk, which, to be honest, was as average as normal, I did an appeal for anyone who wanted to decide to choose to surrender their life to Jesus. And the first hand straight in the air was that lady. And then afterwards I got to pray with her. And the Monday afterwards I got a message from the pastor just saying how renewing, how refreshing and how revitalizing it was to see first-time decisions for Jesus in their place on a Sunday morning.
Come on.
And you know what? We celebrate the masses, but sometimes we need to celebrate the ones.
Yeah.
There were other decisions for Jesus in that place, but that woman, people have been praying in her orbit. Probably 5 or 6 people have been part of the journey to get her to that place. Yeah. Now there'll be another 4 or 5 people to journey on the discipleship. But if you're listening to this now, you can be that one for someone. It's Andrew who brings Peter to Jesus. What we're supposed to be is signposts. Yeah. And I think the greatest joy of our jobs, in many ways, is being a signpost for someone, but also being a signpost alongside many other signposts. Yeah. And so that gave me great joy. What about you?
Yeah, I'm going to tell the story on this one about my local church, actually. Travel all over the place, but also just love my postcode. And we've been based in the same church. I've been part of it for almost 40 years. And for us, it's a really hard-pressed kind of council estate in Birmingham. We're in the top 2% of deprivation in the country. But God has been amazing over the years. We turned up as a family in the 1980s when it was a few people around an organ. And we've seen extraordinary growth for a church of our kind over the last few decades. And but for us, I wanted to talk about, when we're talking about being hopeful and realistic, the kind of battles and blessings of where we are. So we've had 2 dearly loved people in our church go to be with Jesus in the last year. Yeah. That's been really tough. Yeah. But at the same time, something amazing is happening amongst our young people.
Come on.
So the other Sunday, we had over 60 0 to 18s in our church of less than 150.
I was going to say, that's a third of the church,
right?
Isn't it?
And so there's something amazing happening there. I've been part of the church for those 40 years. I've not really seen anything quite like that before. Yeah. And the reality is, that's the hope. The reality is, there's not enough space. We're in an aging building. Money is tough. And so people are kind of sat on each other's laps in the youth room. It's an small encapsulation of kind of today's theme of the hope and the realism that we face. Yeah. So that's me.
Twin tracks journeying together.
Amen.
We'd love to hear your stories as part of this podcast. Please do get in touch. You can find either of us on social media easily. If it's nasty social media you want, please send that Phil's direction because I get enough in my job. But otherwise, fill in the contact form at goodnewspeople.church. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. So, okay, today, Gav, we're looking at realism and hope. I've got a nice, fun way into the theme for us today. So, for those who are new, each episode, we try to give our listeners a little insight into our crazy jobs. And, do you know, I've got some mates, don't know whether you think you've got these, who kind of think that we've got really glamorous jobs. Like, kind of people who think we're kind of some kind of Christian rock star who turn up to gigs with riders and stuff.
I don't have any mates like that.
But we want to be really clear, it's really not like that. There are definitely some fun bits, but I thought today it will be fun for us to ask the question, what has been your biggest comeback down to earth moment as a Christian communicator?
Well, firstly, I've had one just now because you've got friends that think you're a rock star, and I know you've asked the
They're a minority.
You've asked the Premier team only for red M&Ms. I understand, but I think the biggest one for me when I used to work for Youth for Christ, I was invited to speak in North Wales on a Friday night. Driving to North Wales at any time is a problem. Friday nights,
Unless you live in North Wales.
Well, yeah, of course. I was told there'll be hundreds of young people there. When I got there, turns out I have more fingers than there are young people there. There were 9 young people. The churches had clubbed together to hire in a stage, which was 10 foot high. Because they'd paid for it, they insisted I preach from it. I'm already 6'3". So there I am, 16'3" in the air, towering above a bunch of people smaller in number than the disciples, there to preach the gospel. Didn't want to do it, but I'd been brought in, so I did it badly, and did it in a mood. Back in those days, there were no bank transfers. It was the ministry of envelopes. They would give you the gift in
a
an envelope.
handshake.
Yeah. And I always had a rule. I don't know if you had this rule. Don't open the envelope till you get home. Because if you open it too early, you decide how it went based on the number of zeros on the check. Work out with Jesus how it went and then open the gift. So I got home from North Wales in the early hours of the morning, opened the envelope. Me and the Lord had discussed the event, decided it was an abject failure. Opened the envelope, out fell the gift. £5 book token. You can't put that in the petrol tank. So I paid for my worst ever preach. But then 10 years later, I was preaching in Stoke on a Sunday night. Yeah. This lad comes up to me afterwards and says, do you remember that youth event in North Wales with hardly any young people in the big stage? I'm like, I remember it, mate. You want some, do you? He says, I became a Christian that night.
Brilliant.
I'm like, how?
Yeah.
And he says, and I'm now working with young people, and we've just done an outreach on a local estate, and 32 young lads gave their lives to Jesus.
Right.
You only need one Samaritan woman to get their village.
Yeah.
But the come down for me was huge platform, no people, £5 book token.
Yeah.
But even then, when I did it badly and in a mood, God was gracious enough to move.
Yeah.
What about you, Knox?
Oh, I've had some shockers.
I know.
There was one a couple of summers ago where I was speaking at an event and the accommodation was a leaky tent right next to the main venue. That was a bad night's sleep, and the after hours went on like really late, keep me awake. That was,
boom.
That was really unhelpful. And then I had a similar one to you where I spoke at an event in Cambridge, where they put huge amounts of energy, effort in. They with huge bands, sound system. A bookshop came from a well-known Christian book distributor, which had hundreds of books.
Come on.
Tables everywhere. They spent so much energy on the event they forgot to do any publicity. And while I was on the way there, I was with a young lad I was mentoring, and he said on the way there, I remember this really vividly, on the A14 on the way there, he says, "Have you ever been to an event and no one's ever really turned up?" I said, "No, that's never really happened to me." Well, it was about to happen.
Pride comes before.
You talked about people on your hands. There were more people at this event in the band.
Oh, come on.
But you know what, Gav, do you know what? I felt the Lord say as I got up to speak, if there were thousands of people there, you would give it some. You will give it some right now. Yeah. And so I did. I gave it some. But I have not had quite the story you've had from the lads in Stoke-on-Trent. So if you're at that event in the band from the event in Cambridge and you'd like to get in touch because the Lord transformed your life, I'd love to hear from you.
It's not been 10 years yet. It's not been 10 years.
These things keep us humble.
They do.
Great. Okay, so let's look at the theme. We need a kind of cards on the table moment, the two of us in this moment. When it comes to this tension, realism and hope, it's fair to say our personalities, you and me, Gav, are more hopeful than realistic. But why don't you share a little bit of how personality plays into this tension?
Yeah, there are glass half full people and there are glass half empty people. But I'm not just glass half full. As I said earlier, like the psalmist, my cup overfloweth. But I think that we are asking people to do is live in this tension.
Yeah.
For people like me, I need to work harder at being realistic. As we will see, that's just as needed and just as biblical as being hopeful. But for others who are naturally more glass half empty, they need to work a bit harder at being more hopeful.
Yeah.
But like all the themes in Good News People, We all naturally lend ourselves to one end of the spectrum. And whichever one you're more natural at, we need to work harder at the other side.
Totally. But why does this matter now?
Okay. I'm going to answer this first of all by talking about two different types of hope.
Okay.
For us as Christians, there is hope that everything will be all right in the end.
Yeah.
Jesus wins. Theologians call this eschatological hope.
Yeah.
The big story of the Bible is that history is going somewhere.
Yeah.
Jesus has promised he will return. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And one day, every tear will be wiped from every eye. And like we said, Jesus wins.
Come on. Totally. I just got to tell you a story about how I've seen that play out in our house.
Yeah.
So me and Caleb, my eldest son, I'm doing a bit of discipleship with him. So
well done.
Thank you. We're doing Bible verses together, but also I'm discipling him in some other ways. So I'm obviously discipling him into how to, support Aston Villa.
Of course.
But also, we're watching the James Bond films together. Yeah. And there was a moment a few months ago, we were watching Goldfinger. And there's this moment in Goldfinger where James Bond's about to be cut in half by a giant laser. And Bond turns to Goldfinger and he says, I'm going to do my best Sean Connery impression. He says, do you expect me to talk? And Goldfinger says, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. And Caleb's like right next to me and he's kind of leaning in and he's a bit nervous and he's like, Daddy, does James Bond die? And I'm like, Caleb, have a look at the box set in front of you. How many films are there to come? Not quite yet. When we know how the story ends, it changes everything. Sorry, you were talking about eschatological hope.
I was. But there's the Billy Graham quote that says, I've read the last page of the Bible. It's all going to turn out all right.
Right.
We hold to. Does James Bond ever... I'm not a Bond fan. Does he ever die?
I will let your listeners text you in with that answer.
Wonderful.
I wouldn't want to spoil it for those who've not watched the latest one.
Wonderful. So there is eschatological hope, but there is also present hope. We can be hopeful now because Jesus is at work in the world by his Spirit. There's a common grace. He answers prayers and is on the move. And if you listen to the first episode of this series, you'll know that when it comes to the church in the UK, there are some really good reasons to be hopeful at the moment. Loads of people are becoming Christians, or at least awakening to the fact there must be something deeper. The church is growing significantly for the first time in decades.
Yeah, but we also need to be real, don't we? That quote you gave at the top of the show, if we say things are brilliant all the time, you first of all deceive yourself. There's a realistic moment, as you shared, about churches closing as well as plaid being planted. And I guess if you are only hopeful, you're always quite annoying to people around you.
I think we've both lived that out in a three-dimensional way. Yeah, there's that much elevated characteristic of our age, authenticity.
Yeah.
Now, I think we can go too far here. We've idolised phrases like you be you or like your authentic self.
Yeah.
But I think this trend in society comes from a good and godly place, that we were made to share our struggles as well as our successes.
Yeah.
We weren't made for Instagram highlights. We were made for real living. We are not perfect people, and the world's a hard place.
Yeah. And I think as I read the Bible, that's really biblical as well, right? So you don't have to read too far into the Psalms to see David being really honest with God about what he wants God to do to his enemies. I have a really special place in my heart for Lamentations, and as well as kind of, because the Lord's great love, we're not consumed. Right before that, there's this line, he has broken my teeth with gravel. Jesus weeps in front of his disciples. So authentic. Paul laments he's got this thorn in the flesh, and honesty is really good. And I guess what we're asking us all to do is live in this tension. What we tried to do in the book, we've packed it full of stories with God on the move, but also we're really honest and try to tell a story about the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, there was a moment when 30 member churches left the Evangelical Alliance in a month. Yeah. And that's a lot. We've got 3,000 churches, but 30 is a lot. Yeah. And so I thought, I better ring around them. So I rang around the 30 thinking, they're all going to have left for X or Y. But it turns out one left because the Evangelical Alliance wasn't clear enough on human sexuality. Yeah. One left because the Evangelical Alliance is too clear on human sexuality. But 28 of the 30 were leaving because they were either closed or closing. Yeah, well. Now, this is at the same time as we've got all these stories of openness, all these stories of church growth. We know there's more Christians in the UK than there were, but there's 28 churches where people have had a vision, planted a church, been involved in a church, dug in for years, some of whom have been running for years and years and years, and they're closing their doors. Now, I think it's the tale of COVID even, going back that far, because some churches never fully recovered. You had 12 people in a boiler, the boiler broke, and a number of people left. It's been hard. Yeah. But we have to be realistic about the fact that just as there is all this openness, there's also some people who are having to shut the doors of their churches and close them at the same time.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it? I think since the various bits of research came out last year around the Quiet Revival, you meet loads of people who've seen remarkable growth, and for others for whom it's a completely different picture. And I think we also need to apply that, I think, to our own lives and our own relationships as well. You know, being a Christian should make us more hopeful.
Yeah.
And I saw this recently. Statistically, it does.
Oh, come on.
There's some recent research that says that church-going Christians are 1.5 times more likely to feel hopeful about the future. And the world in which we live at the moment, I just think there's such a vacuum of hope. And we carry that. And by the way, we carry both those types of hope. Both those types of hope that Gav was talking about. And but how do we help each other in this area?
I think, first of all, we need to be aware of our personalities and where we naturally land. So I'm a natural optimist. So I'm utterly convinced that England are going to win the World Cup in the summer. Now, when I crushingly realise that once again they don't, I'll have to face the realistic other side. But my personality is inclined to #believe when it comes to the Three Lions, despite the fact they've destroyed my life time and time and time again. But then I wonder about the intentionality of modelling the other end of the spectrum. So for those of us who are glass half full, intentionally being honest and real. You know, if ever I am to say something like, well, I'm really struggling with something, it's almost like an alarm goes off, because if you're struggling, but actually we need to be real. We need to be authentic and genuine. And those of us who are glass half empty need to choose to embrace the kind of hope we've been talking about. Yeah. And we also need each other. We're called to be a body. I think finding people who are different to you and spending time with them helps us here. I want to surround myself with people who are realistic, so that matches my hopefulness. But I also want to be around some hopeful people, because the challenge too is one person's realism is someone else's pessimism. But we need to read the signs of the times and then look upwards and remain hopeful.
You're totally right. And I think that applies to both our friendship settings, but also to kind of our church settings. And especially those, many people listening will be involved in some kind of church leadership, whether that's kind of voluntary or part of a wider team. And I think we need in our church teams the hopeful optimists to inspire us forward and say, we can do it. But we also need the kind of pragmatic realists who are the detail people to try and help us get there. And the problem is, I think sometimes the hopeful people get frustrated when I've been in meetings where the realists seemingly pour cold water on their enthusiasm and passion. But also, I think we need to be aware that sometimes the realists get annoyed at people like us for being too hopeful and try to drive stuff through without thinking about the details and consequences. We need each other in this.
Couldn't agree more. But talking of teams and people who embody this well, let's welcome today's guest. Well, I'm really excited today that we're joined by our great friend Ness Wilson. Ness, it's great to have you. And for those who may not know you, Ness is the team leader of Open Heaven Church in Loughborough, the UK leader for the Pioneer Network of Churches. We're really grateful to you that your church, yourself, you're both members of EA, and you're on our council as well. And you're part of the leadership team that deliver wildfires. But most importantly, you really love Jesus. And this theme really fits with you. And I have to say, Ness, as well, thank you for you. You and Rich have been role models to the likes of me and my wife Anne, and Phil and his wife Danny, in that you've gone ahead and you've shown what it is to both minister in slightly separate contexts but do it together, and we all really look up to you. And so thank you for the contribution you make, but more than that, thanks for joining us today. So welcome.
Ness, when we were thinking about how we put together this podcast and the kind of people we wanted on, you just embodied that good news person, good news people that we want to talk about. And so for you, when you think about being a good news person, what does that mean for you? And how do you think that kind of leans into that evangelical word as well?
So to me, it is all about Jesus. It's the person of Jesus, who I'm just so profoundly grateful to for all that he's done. And I just really love Jesus. So for me, being evangelical, it's all about Jesus, in our words, in our actions, that when people are around us, it's like they see something of him, they hear something of him. And then, of course, the whole thing in terms of the high view of Scripture. So one of the things I'm loving at the moment is the curiosity in the culture of the Word of God. And I feel like people are discovering the treasure that is the Word of God in in the way that I guess I've been privileged to be brought up with a high view of Scripture, and it is a source of life to me. And it's wonderful that people, brand new Christians, are going, I never realised it was this relevant, that it was this good, that it could speak to me in such a deep way. So probably, yeah, those two things for me are right at the heart of what it means to be an evangelical.
It's amazing. And do you find, because I find this, when some newer people to the faith encounter Scripture and it brings it alive, it does something for me too.
Totally.
It really lights something, doesn't it?
Totally. I'm genuinely being really challenged by the hunger that new Christians have got to read the Bible. Yeah. It's like they're ploughing through it. They're coming out with verses from, at times, quite obscure parts of the Bible. And I'm thinking, unless I keep my game up, they are going to know the Word of God.
Yeah. We've seen that. We're on a WhatsApp group with a load of new Christians.
Yeah.
And we've just put together one of these kind of Bible reading plans.
Yeah.
And they've jumped on it straight.
Yeah.
We've seen that absolute hunger.
Yeah. So I'm actually loving how new Christians are leading the way.
That's great.
In this.
It's kind of challenging and inspiring, and if I'm honest, a bit convicting, isn't it?
It is. It totally is.
Now, Ness, you are full of good news stories. You, of all the members on the EA Council, you send me more stories and more to offer. Doing anything, I've got these 5 or these 4. Can you be disciplined enough to tell us 1 or 2? but we'd love to hear some good news stories of what you're seeing.
Okay, so we genuinely have seen a marked increase in both the number of people becoming Christians, but also the order of the stories is different. So whereas for many, many years, oftentimes at baptisms, there would be a little bit of a typical testimony, brought up in a Christian home, fell away during teenage years, and then kind of come back to God. I probably about 18 months ago began to realize, oh my goodness, the stories are different. There's more stories of people who have had no church background and are being plucked out of often dark and desperate situations, and their stories are much more touched by the supernatural.
Tell us more about that.
So, well, a real favourite story, partly because now this young man is part of our home, our household, someone I'm very, very fond of. So his name is Marcos. And so it was just over a year ago, and he, whenever he closed his eyes, began to have visions of Jesus.
Wow.
Never been to church before, non-Christian family, no reference points, and yet would close his eyes, see Jesus, open his eyes, shake his head. What is that? Close his eyes.
And when you say see Jesus, do you know what he saw?
Yeah, what he saw, because I've asked him the same question. Yeah. So every time he closed his eyes, he saw basically bright light and the outline of a person that he just somehow knew was Jesus.
Wow.
Would have started having these spiritual experiences, and was living with his long-term girlfriend. She would come back from work and he'd go, "This is kind of weird. I don't know what to make of it. Do you think God might be real? We're having these strange kind of visions of what I think is Jesus." She was like, "I don't know." Again, non-Christian background, never been to church. But she works in a cafe, and one of her work colleagues is Alice, part of Open Heaven. So so Marcos began to send questions to his girlfriend Monique, who would then ask Alice at work all kinds of questions, all the standard questions, get the answer, go back to Monique, then go back to Marcos. Eventually, Alice plucked up the courage to invite them to church. This was just over a year ago. And so they came to church for the very first time. They said they were kind of nervous, didn't know what to expect, but then were blown away. Loads of people their age, so welcoming, all the rest of it. And he was given a Bible and he read the whole of the New Testament in 4 days. They came back again the following Sunday and there was a challenge about praying specific prayers. And he decided to pray a specific prayer around his dad. So when his mom was pregnant with him, his dad had walked out on them. And his prayer was, "God, does that side of the family kind of want to know me?" The next day, completely out of the blue, he got a text from his half-brother saying, "We've just been talking with our side of the family. We'd love to meet you, get to know you. So for him, that was an unbelievable answer to prayer.
Yeah.
Then that night we had something called Upper Room, which is kind of like our worship space. And he went and someone said to him, mate, you should really get Rich Wilson to pray for you. And he just thought, that's so weird. Like, get another man to pray for me. Like, what is that about? But he just thought, he's like, okay, I'll do it. So Rich laid hands on him and prayed for him. And he basically said he just then felt warmth flood his body. And his description, which was brilliant, was, I felt like I'd eaten piping hot porridge and then put a warm winter coat on. And he was sweating, just burning up like a furnace. And then we have the cross like in the middle of this worship space. And he said, and Rich kind of said, where are you at? He said, I'm 99% there, but just like a last 1%. And Rich said, like, mate, there's enough signs that God is real and he's got you. The last 1% is called faith. And then he decided, he said, he walked towards the cross really slowly. He said it was the most difficult thing to walk, and then he knelt before the cross. But he said it was so difficult because he'd never submitted to anyone in authority, because his dad had walked out on them. He said, but after he submitted and surrendered at the cross, he stood up and he said it was the most wonderful thing that he had ever done. And he's just now gone from strength to strength. And actually now him and his girlfriend are actually now in our household.
Wow.
Separate rooms. There's a whole story there in terms of conviction of now living completely differently.
Wow. I think what's most amazing to me, though, Ness, is you could have probably picked 15, 20, 30 stories. Yeah. If you'd had that one, because let's be honest, some of those things you've just said, read the whole New Testament in 4 days, prayed for and felt like it was boiling porridge inside his loins. 99% certain. I mean, most people have to take a bigger step than 1%.
Yeah.
If that story had happened 5 or 10 years ago, you probably would have told that for a year and a half.
Yeah. Yes, but
now, it feels like now there's another one next week.
There is.
Can I also say, if you're listening to this and thinking about how those themes interrelate and what this means for you in your walk and for your friends, I just want to draw out a few themes that I think are really relevant to this whole conversation of how we're seeing people come to faith. So first of all, spiritual experience. We need to be praying that people like Marcus keep having those visions, because we're seeing more and more of that. Yes. Secondly, the role of Alice. Was it Alice the barista?
Yeah.
I want to say, if you're listening to this, be more Alice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So be there.
Come on.
The fact that those friends turned to Alice, and she was the person who probably didn't have all the answers, but did her best, and then made the invitation. Yeah. Right? So in this season, if you're listening, you've got friends who are exploring. Invite. Yeah. Next thing, get a Bible in people's hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get them reading that New Testament.
Yeah.
And then the final theme, the challenge to make the decision. So actually, it would have been really easy, wouldn't it, to leave Marcus in that room without saying, Marcus, actually, you still need to choose to follow Jesus.
Yes.
And I think being people who are spiritual midwives and get people over the line, I think is really key.
Yeah.
So thanks, Ness. That's amazing.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, but I guess for me, because it's like you're right about that would have been like unbelievable story, but then it's felt like, so over. We've kind of kept a bit of a track as to, salvations. And for many, many years, it was sort of in the, sometimes a handful, sometimes up in the teens. And again, partly some of what's going on is we then worked out between summer 24 and summer 25, 40 people had given their lives to Jesus. And then now, since September to where we're at now, December, 25 people have become Christians. So that's what I mean by the pace is different and the order of the stories is different. And so so Marcus is one then of then a whole load of others. So even like I'm thinking 2 weeks ago, Alpha, someone on my table. So there's 2 people on my table, very, very open and being drawn to Jesus, one of whom has now become a Christian. But there was also somebody who was actually quite strongly argumentative, very articulate, quite vociferous, kind of had lots of thought through answers as to why all this wasn't real. And when and you're on the table, there's someone who's kind of quite like that, and then there's. And
I know well.
It's like I wanted to put my hand over the ears of those who were being drawn to faith, but you have to just trust God, don't you? And so I was like, well, that was really hard. You know, sometimes you go away from Alpha rather than like your heart singing. Sometimes like, oof. Then I went back into the office the following morning and someone else was on my table said, you won't believe this, but that young woman, Ella, who was so articulate and kind of anti, I've got a text from her that she sent at 2:30 a.m, which said, I've just given my life to Jesus.
Wow.
I'm like, that's unbelievable.
That's
What is going on? And so the story is she then ended up walking back onto campus, decided, strangely, to go to the library at like 10 p.m. after Alpha. Sat down, there wasn't a plug. She moved to a place where there was a plug. And then as she tried to open up her computer and start to work, she realised there's a conversation going on behind her, two people talking about Jesus. She's thinking, I've just come from an Alpha course, two people talking about Jesus. Then someone else comes along, joins in the conversation, they start witnessing to him. Someone else then comes along, they start talking about homelessness and how the church is responding to that. She's like, that's mad. Homelessness is an issue I feel really passionate about. So their conversation then comes to an end. She plucks up the courage, chats to then one of the guys, and he happens to have also been part of Open Heaven. He witnesses with her. I think he prays with her. She goes back to her room full of all, you know, because she was full of hurt and questions and confusion. But I think just came to the place of thinking, I have to surrender. This is a beautiful part of the story. She decided, after wrestling, she thought, this is going to be a really important decision in my life, and I want this to be something really special. So she made herself a hot chocolate and got under a duvet and then gave her life to Jesus. And then, because she met up with a friend up the following day, and she said all of that anger, the hurt and the confusion, at the moment she gave her life to Jesus, it left.
Mate, wow.
And then she comes back to Alpha next week. It's on your side.
And everyone's like, what's happened? What's happened to Saul? You know,
it's like, so that, you know, it's those kinds of,
Amazing. Well, two things I would say. Firstly, let's just remind everyone listening, we've said this before, the season's changed.
Yeah.
Don't live on yesterday's rules in today's world.
Totally.
Don't live on 2024 expectations in this season.
Yeah.
It's a different day.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you'd like to join my campaign to get Premier to give Ness her own podcast just to tell us these stories of encouragement every week, then do email in.
Yeah, very good. Gav, I was reminded when I knew we were having Ness on the podcast today that she was, I think, just about the only endorser of our book who came back and told us off for being too negative.
Yes.
So we were accused of many things when we wrote the book, but one of the things that only Ness came back and said, because
not hopeful enough.
She also said, it's a new day.
Yeah.
You know, we were referring back to examples and a world.
Like Frank Skinner.
Right, we were referring
and
back
to the chill factor.
Yeah. And you were saying, guys, this is when a new season. And we weren't, at the time of writing, we weren't quite where we are in terms of the news, the quiet revival, etc. So you were prophetically ahead of the curve. And we also sensed your gentle rebuke and made it more hopeful. But when we come to this theme around being hopeful and realistic,
yes,
thank you for both embodying and encouraging us to do that.
Yeah.
But also, you also strike us as someone who knows the realities of life as well.
Yeah.
Tell us why this theme of hopefulness and realism matters to you.
Yeah, it matters to me a lot. I think because, my own personal story is I feel that if it wasn't for the fact that God understands suffering, we worship a God who has suffered, and a God who is able to still draw a bigger circle around the worst of human experience. If that wasn't true, then I don't think I'd still be here. So I guess I look back on my life, and the whole thing that we need to have a robust theology that embraces both, hope and healing, but also the reality of suffering. It's just important to me, and that's mainly because in my own personal family life, we have experienced tragedy and heartache, as well as just fantastic joy and provision and some of the best of life, some of the worst of life, and so that really is mainly based in 2 of our 3 children have gone ahead to glory. So a little boy called Josiah, who died when he was a baby, who was born between our 2 girls, and then our youngest daughter, Lauren, who died of a brain tumour, age 13, 4 years ago. And so, Scripture talks about being hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. I think I know what it feels like to be hard-pressed, but not crushed. One of the things that Lauren said to me, when she knew she was probably going to die, she was concerned how Rich and I would cope. And I remember saying to her, but as I was saying it to her, I was kind of saying it to myself as well. I was like, darling, if you die, we will be devastated, but we won't be destroyed. And I kind of knew that. I knew we would not be destroyed, partly because we'd gone through the grief of losing a child beforehand. And I think there's just something about the eternal perspective that the gospel gives us that means the world to me. It really does. It means the world to me that I'm going to see them again. I can't wait. I do. I long for the day when Jesus comes back. Or if not, I die and go. And even things like in worship, I don't know if this sounds a bit strange, but I sometimes become very aware that, it's the one activity that I can still share with them.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that whole thing of death really is defeated. It's not the end, and a day will come when all will be restored and all will be made well. And even just watching, so not just the fact that Rich and I have been able to walk through, grief twice of losing our children, but even watching a 13-year-old who had a really special relationship with Jesus, watching how a 13-year-old can experience her body shutting down and head towards glory with zero fear of death or dying.
Yeah.
That was extraordinary.
It's incredible.
It really, really was extraordinary. It's hard to put into words.
Yeah.
She had this picture like I think it was 3 weeks before she died. And the picture was of like her standing on God's feet, like sometimes a daughter will dance with their dad. And she said, I'm surrounded by light and I'm surrounded by love. And God is saying to me, it's okay, I've got you and I know which way we're going. She just had like unbelievable peace and continued to encourage us. Never lashed out, never got angry.
Wow.
It was honestly unbelievable to watch.
Yeah. I mean, thank you firstly for being so honest. Yeah. That will help so many. But I guess, Ness, because you and Rich journeyed that, not all in public, but you are public people, so you couldn't hide. And you did that beautifully. But there'll be people listen to this now. They won't be going through exactly the same, but they'll be going through the most difficult of circumstances. And in those circumstances, it does seem easier than at other times to sort of question the Lord.
Yeah.
Where is the Lord in this? How can this be happening to me? I was promised life in all its fullness. This feels like the opposite.
Yeah.
I guess what would you say? What would you say to someone listening now who they want to be hopeful, but at the moment, to be honest, getting up in the morning's enough?
Yeah.
How can they begin to lean in and find some of that hope in the midst of such trying circumstances?
I think, I can only just share some of the things that helped me. So, one, be honest. So I just knew I had to stay facing God with all of my pain and confusion and heartache and agony. And sometimes I'd have an image of me almost like beating my fist, on God's chest, because of course that it's not fair. Like, how could this have happened? all the prayers, all those questions. But I just knew you have to stay facing God and not turn your back.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you turn your back on God, for me, it was like I've lost so much. But if I lose my connection to my Father, I've lost everything. Yeah. I've lost the only way that can get me through this. So be honest. I also kind of just, for me, it just came back very much to a very, very childlike kind of posture of I will never understand this, and so I lay down my right to understand. And the posture of a child, which is, I don't get it, but I will trust you, God.
Wow.
And I there was part of it that almost sort of saw. I kind of thought my head can't lead the way in walking through the middle of this pain. It can only be my heart that leads the way, because I kind of felt like my heart can stay connected to my Father, who I know loves me, even though it doesn't feel like it. I trust, like the posture of a child.
Yeah.
I can't let my head lead the way, because my head is just too full of unanswerable questions. So, and I'd read before a quote which really helped me, which was, "Don't let your pain shape your image of God. Let your image of God shape your pain."
Come on, that's so helpful, because it's not quite the same story, but Anne and I had a lot of challenges for children. We did lose one younger man, lots of challenges. But during that time, the Christians were not helping.
Yeah,
because they kept saying, "Does this make you question sort of your belief in God?" And I'm like, how? Why is a Christian asking me that?
Yeah.
And it felt like if life is pants, and God isn't real, I've just lost twice.
Yeah, exactly.
But if life is pants and I can cling to Jesus, in desperation, I almost think non-Christians say, "Why does God allow suffering?"
Yeah.
The Christians should say, "Where is God in the suffering?"
Yeah, that's right.
And certainly our experience was, hold your hand, and He is there.
Yeah.
But you do have to reach for Him.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I do. It's like you have to. Yeah, for me, it was like I was really struggling. Even just Jesus on the cross, you've got both. And my God, why have you forsaken me? So you've got the pain being expressed, but you've also got, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so I just thought that there is a way to be able to be honest about the pain, and at the same time say, but into your hands I commit who I am, who I'm becoming, the future. I commit my children.
Wow.
So
it's also extraordinary. I thought you referenced that passage from 2 Corinthians 4 about being hard pressed, but not crushed. For me, as I've journeyed through my own pain, that's been so significant.
Yeah.
And actually, when we talk, I don't know whether you can remember the book, but that's how we frame this realism and hope. We have this treasure.
Yeah.
Jesus is alive.
Yeah.
We're hopeful. Jesus lives in us. Christ in us, the hope of glory.
Yeah.
And yet we are fragile, broken jars of clay.
Yes.
The treasure is in jars of clay.
Yeah.
And I think that I love the fact you brought it up, and I think if you're listening to this and need a kind of a Bible passage to live that out, that 2 Corinthians 4 passage is so helpful.
It really is. Yeah.
And I guess looking at you as a church leader as well for a moment, how does a church live out this realistic and hopeful posture? What does that look like? Because we travel to lots of different churches, and I have to be honest, some of them seem more hopeful, and some of them, I dare say, seem more realistic. I'm not sure they always feel like they hold both together. How do we do that as church, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of it is having that whole thing of we mustn't have a flawed theology. Yeah. So understand that, that we are able to hold the tension of the hope and the realism, the suffering. Because if you don't, then you find people whose story doesn't fit will exit out the back door. Yeah. And I never wanted us to have a church culture where, if people were living in an unanswered prayer, or life was just pants, that somehow they exited because they couldn't fit. So I think it's really important that we find that way actually where we are able to hold on to the both, and so that means even in kind of sometimes there's times of testimony, isn't there, where there's testimonies of people who are finding the hope and the strength to stand strong in the storms of life, as well as the people who are giving the stories of God's provision or answered prayers. So for church cultures that can hold the both is really important. It's a bit like the early church. You had Peter miraculously freed from prison. James beheaded. Like, you would have had friends and family of both rejoicing and grieving, and yet in the same church community. So
no, it's true. And that testimony thing's a good point, because I don't know, I'm a bit tired of going to baptisms where you see people's testimony and you've known that person for a while and they might have dabbled in a few things, but the way they describe their pre-Christian life is they were like a drug-dealing gang lord. And then they say, I became a Christian, that's the end of the testimony. And I've never really understood that. Yeah. When I became a Christian, my life got more fulfilled, but it also got a bit more challenging because my choices were no longer mine.
Yes.
Then a few years later, I got married and then I had all kinds of authority to live under. But, in those spaces, I think we need to do better at telling the honest testimony of what it is like to live with Jesus, not what it's just like to come up to the moment of a decision for Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think I have to say that you and Rich have done that in a way that's challenged, helped and inspired loads of us. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Ness, you're not just an amazing leader. You are an amazing leader, but you're also a leader of leaders. So your pioneer network that you're part of is amazing. Some amazing churches. We know some great leaders part of that. I guess at the moment with this awakening of what's happening, you're seeing across the whole of your network lots of stories of that, but it's probably happening in some churches more than others.
Yes.
How do you lead leaders in this hopeful and realistic posture where you've got some churches where it'll be off the chart, off the chain, and you've got other leaders where you we're not just quite seeing it yet? How do you do that?
Yeah, that is a real challenge. Actually, it's something that it's live right now.
Yeah, I bet.
And I guess, a couple of things is I'm kind of communicating the message, we're all in this together. We're all on the same side. Like every
There's one bottom line and it's going up.
Exactly. Your win is our win. That whole thing of like, the tide is rising. And so we're all in that. And to encourage leaders who are not seeing perhaps, this kind of the increase in salvation or those kind of things. Really, all I'm doing is I'm just pleading, keep your heart soft. Yeah. So bless what God is doing. Yeah. Just thank God for it. And I know that is really hard, but I also know that if you become resentful or cynical, or all those other
disillusioned.
things. Yeah, disillusioned. Then that ultimately is going to be the worst thing that can happen for that leader's heart and therefore then for their church community. So I know it's easier said than done, because I also know there's times, obviously, I've been in ministry for over 30 years, and there's times you see amazing things happening and, oh Lord, why not here? So I understand it, but I'm just encouraging church leaders, wherever you're at, it's something amazing is happening and God is on the move. Yeah. It's not like it is a personality or a program, that's the incredible thing. Oh my goodness, Jesus the evangelist is on the move.
Despite us a lot of the time.
Yes, and building his church. Like for us, we're not doing anything different. Jesus is doing something. So I think keeping people's eyes lifted up, this is a sovereign thing. God is on the move. It is a new season. And so to keep your heart right, it's one of my main messages. But also, I think one of the best antidotes to weariness or disillusionment or cynicism is actually find a way to get around a new Christian. It is. So just encouraging leaders, even if it's not happening in your church, go to a place where it is and just sit and have a coffee with someone who's just discovered how good Jesus is.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It does you so much good.
So, yeah, I love that soft heart thing as well. We've got to keep our hearts soft, haven't we?
Yeah.
One of the prayers I pray of myself in my EA role every day is, Lord, give me a thick skin but also a soft heart. Yeah. And if I have to choose one, I'm going for the soft heart. Yeah, yeah. But I kind of need both. Yeah. And I think for us as leaders, we need to keep that softness and this loud awakening, as I like to call it. Yeah. I'm not quite sure we're in revival yet. No. This loud awakening. No. It's an amazing time. Yeah. Ness, we would love to talk to you all day, but sadly, time is of the essence a little. So one last question. We're still fairly early on into a new year in 2026. And looking ahead, what do you think is a key thing the Lord is saying to his church at this moment?
The 180-degree return to disciple making. So the shift is moving from reaching to making. And unless we are creating discipleship cultures, like real like full on intentional disciple making pathways, then the wave of people that Jesus is bringing into his church, are not going to become the whole lifelong, wholehearted disciples that we need in order to, I look back at the last Great Awakening and the genius of Wesley. He knew how to disciple a nation. So Whitfield talks about, his converts were like a rope of sand. Wesley's, because there was robust, classy societies, bands. So we're relationships. So we're introducing like bands, 3 or 4 people with a kind of a contemporary version of the Wesley questions, including kind of confessing sin and, what is God saying to you? So that the norm that new Christians are coming into is discipleship. It's not a kind of discipleship is an optional extra, but it's life on life, relational, word of God based discipleship.
So to break my own rule, because I said that was the last question, apart from listening to the podcast episode on going for decisions but making disciples.
Oh, okay.
Is there a book or a place or someone's listening to that and think, yes,
yeah,
but we're not as good at that as Open Heaven are at the moment. We're not quite there.
Yeah.
Is there somewhere you might point them to that might be able to help them a little on that journey?
I think Fusion's got some great resources. Right. I probably would say that.
Plug away. Plug away. We want to help people. Fusion are wonderful.
Great resources on discipleship. And actually going back, this maybe sounds, I don't know, old school, but like we've gone back to like the Discovery Bible Study methods. We've just produced really simple guides of like 10 passages if you're curious about faith, 10 passages if you just become a Christian, the same 3 questions. What does it show us about God? What does it show us about people? What must I do in the light of it? And anyone can do it. So someone who's been a Christian for 3 weeks can do it with someone who's been a Christian 3 days, and someone who's been a Christian 3 days can do it with a spiritually curious friend. It's the Word of God and reading asking the Holy Spirit to be the teacher, I think is just a very amazing, practical way to bring discipleship into the heart of our churches again.
Amazing. Ness, I felt like I've been on a journey over the last kind of half an hour of my life of kind of laughter and hopefulness and the gritty reality of grief and bereavement, and then some really amazing stories, practical application. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so grateful. Wow. Gav, wasn't that amazing?
Oh, it's just incredible. And Ness is wonderful. I mean, she's our friend. We've known her for years. We've heard her speak loads. But as she shared some of those stories and some of her pain and some of her joy, it just, what an impact that's had on us and on everyone listening. What a moment that was.
Yeah, what stood out for you?
I think 2 things. I think, firstly, the fact that she's got bucket loads of stories.
Yeah.
I mean, we're preachers. We travel around. The story, when you get a good one, for years, you'd use that quite often. It feels like with Ness, there's a new story every week. And the fact that this sort of quiet revival or loud awakening is really happening was so encouraging. I think the other thing was when she spoke about losing children and keeping going in the midst of the pain. My story's different, but Anne and I lost a baby. We had some real challenges with our son in the womb. It brought a lot of that back. But it also, how she was still hopeful. She leant into Jesus, didn't turn away from Jesus. She pursued the Lord in her pain. She allowed the Lord to hold her hand through her suffering. And I just think for anyone listening who's going through pain, whatever it might be, however difficult, lean into Jesus. Don't turn away from him. He's longing to hold you in his everlasting arms, help you through this season, and help you be hopeful again, however challenging your time. And I think Ness modelled that beautifully. But to anyone listening, please, lean into the Lord. He is with you. He is for you. And he will help you journey through these challenges you're facing. Yeah. What about for you?
Yeah, I think for me, if you're listening, there was a moment where the atmosphere in the room changed. So we went from raucously laughing at her more than gentle critique of our first manuscript.
Gentle?
Yeah. and we went from this moment of really roaring to just the gravity, the weight of Ness then sharing her really honest story. And I think in that moment, as I reflect and remember, that encapsulates a lot of this theme, that we as Christians have unexpressible joy. We know the hope of Jesus in our hearts now, real hope in heaven forever. But at the same time, life's hard.
Yeah.
Life's full of blessings as it is battles.
Yeah.
And we go through this life needing to be authentic, needing to be real, needing to be serious about life and be honest with one another in a world that actually many people superficially gloss over a lot of the challenges we face. And so I think just the embodiment of the whole of this theme of being realistic and hopeful in almost 30 seconds, I thought that was really profound and really, really beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what a challenge, and much food for thought. And you know what? This may sound strange. It's our podcast, one that I'm going to listen back to more than once because I want to hear Ness's input again and again. This podcast, as many of you know, is based on a book, Good News People. If you've not read it yet, it is worth getting. It is worth reading, and it does expound on today's posture as well as the others, to a really great level. And thanks to Ness's correction, it's hopeful enough too. We also both work for the Evangelical Alliance. We're a membership organisation. We seek to unite Christians in reaching the lost in every corner of the UK and to speak truth to power with a clear, united, confident voice. If you're not yet a personal member and you're an evangelical Christian, we'd love you to join. Maybe you'd go to eauk.org/join us. And we'd also love to say that we love working with Premier. This is a great friendship we have here. And we would want to point anyone listening to this now to premier.plus to check out other podcasts and other materials available and to do all you can to gain so much from the many different things that Premier are producing.
We'd also absolutely love you to get in touch. We've heard stories from Ness today. Send us your good news stories of what God is doing in your town or church. You can find us on social media, or you can go to goodnewspeople.church. There's a contact form there. We'd love you to get in touch. We've heard stories from Ness today.
Yeah.
Gav, you are hearing stories as you travel all over the place at the moment. What have you got coming up over the next few days?
Yeah, I've got a variety of things. Firstly, I need to get suited and booted.
Come on.
There's definitely a tie and a jacket because myself and one of our team at the Evangelical Alliance, Alicia Edmond, we are speaking at a prayer breakfast at the National Club.
Wow.
So that'll be a fun day in the middle of central London, just behind the Ritz.
Do you enjoy getting dressed up?
No, but I do it quite often.
No.
I do it quite often. And my wife often says, do you want a suit for Christmas or for your birthday? No. I have to wear a suit for my job, and therefore it has to come out of the core family budget. It's not a treat. But nonetheless, I probably put a suit on once every week or two. And then at the weekend, really great for me. For once, I'm not travelling very far, travelling about 6 miles to King's Church in Amersham, an incredibly vibrant EA member church, to go and speak at their 2 services and share some hope. What about yourself?
So speaking at a Baptist leaders conference next week. So shout out to the Baptists. We've had a denominational representation today. All good. So you're really excited about that. Talking about missional pathways, encouraging, inspiring people in mission, but also so good to hear as well from the breadth of the church about what God's doing. And then speaking at a church over the weekend, doing some evangelism training on the Saturday, preaching on the Sunday. Really excited about that. So listen out for the next episode to hear more good news stories of how Jesus is changing lives across the UK. We're also going to explore in the next episode another really important posture of how we live in this exciting moment for the church.
Thanks so much for listening to Good News People. If you get a chance, please share a link with friends and family. Write a review on wherever you get your podcasts. We're a brand new podcast getting started, and we could really do with your help in getting the word out there. Let's change the narrative and be good news people in a bad news world.
God bless you and see you next time.